Welcome back to Journey at Home. If it's your first time, thanks for tuning in. Be sure to hit that subscribe button and bell for notifications, because today we are beginning a brand new series called My Dysfunctional Family, which I'm sure doesn't sound like your family at all, does it? But probably know somebody this is going to relate to, and I bet we'll learn a few things ourselves. So here's what we're going to talk about. This week's episode is the introduction, and then in episode 2, we're going to give you a question that I hope becomes your family's favorite question, because even if you're not a church person or a follower of Jesus, this question actually works for everybody. And then the third episode, we're going to talk about fighting and conflict in families. In the fourth and final episode, we're going to talk about how to deal with strained family relationships. And we're going to give you a plan that I think will increase your chances of reconciling. Now, the thing that makes talking about this so challenging is we all come from diverse family experiences, don't we? No two families are alike. Some of you've got traditional families. Some of you have blended families. Some of you have single parent families. Some of you don't have kids. Some of you are raising kids, or you're raising somebody else's kids, or you have adopted kids. You know, our family experiences, they are so diverse. And so as I was thinking about this, I thought, well, what do we have in common? And I came up with two things. When it comes to our family of origin, number one, we don't have a choice. I mean, you can pick your friends, you can't pick your family. If you could, there probably been times when you would have picked your friend's family, wouldn't you? You remember back when you were in high school, how much cooler your friend's family seemed than yours? I mean, their dad was so fun and their mom was so great. They let the kids stay up late and eat cake for breakfast and cereal for dinner, you know? But here we're all stuck with our families. So that's one thing. And then the second thing that we have in common is family is difficult. Every single family is dysfunctional in some way. The word father, come on, you know this, that's never an emotionally neutral word, is it? Same for mother and brother and sister. There's good, there's bad, there's joy, there's pain. It's all mixed into family. You've got great memories, you got not so great memories. And you can't separate one from the other. But maybe this is going to encourage you. Did you know there are almost no good role model kind of families mentioned in the scriptures? It's interesting, isn't it? If you think about Adam and Eve, well, that family didn't go well for very long at all. Adam and Eve rebelled against God, and then they had one son murder another son. It's not exactly the role models we're looking for. Think about David's family. Well, that was a dysfunctional mess. He had a son rape his sister, another son killed that son, and then that son tried to coup to overthrow his dad and ended up starting a civil war. I mean, even Jesus' own family wasn't exactly amazing. His mom and dad lost him in Jerusalem when he was 12 years old. It took them 3 days to miss him, to realize he wasn't there. And Jesus' own brothers and sisters thought he was out of his mind for claiming he was God before Jesus came back to life at the resurrection. So when you look at the New Testament documents, you don't find the writers saying, hey, let me tell you about this family that you all should be like, because all those families were dysfunctional. Instead, the writers would say, let me describe what a healthy, functional family looks like. Let me point you in the direction of what it takes for your family to function the way God intended for it to function. But that raises a tension that's going to be a part of everything we talk about over the next few episodes. See, there is the ideal. The ideal is what Jesus introduced to the world. The ideal is how God created family to function. The ideal is what you long in your heart for your family to be like. You got the ideal. But then there's the real, because your family isn't ideal, is it? Your family of origin isn't ideal, and even if you're married, you haven't created an ideal marriage with your new family. So there's always a gap between the two. What do you do with the gap? See, this gap, that's what creates tension for us. The gap's what gets us stuck. So I want to show you exactly what to do with the gap. I want to show you what Jesus said we ought to do with the gap. Over and over, Jesus taught and pointed people towards what's ideal. But the good news is he refused to condemn people who fell short. In other words, he didn't dumb down the truth and he didn't turn down the grace. He wouldn't lower the ideal to make it easier for people to meet it, but he never wrote people off when they couldn't meet it. With Jesus, the standard got higher and the grace went deeper. The expectations got higher, but the forgiveness ran deeper, all at the same time. Now, I think we'd rather hold on to one or the other, but I'm telling you, this is what it looks like to be full of grace and truth. Are we willing to embrace an ideal that may never be a reality in our current family? Or are we going to try to water down the ideal to feel better about where we currently are? Are we willing to embrace an ideal that we know we may never live up to? Or it could be too late for us to live up to? Or are we going to take an easier route and just redefine the ideal as what's true of me right now, so the standard is, well, it's where I'm currently at and I can meet it? I want to show you an example of how Jesus held on to both the ideal and the real at the same time. And I want to encourage you to do the same, but I've got to tell you what I'm about to share with you. Well, this is an emotional issue. It creates a lot of tension, but Jesus was actually okay with the tension it created. And if we follow Jesus, we have to learn how to hold the ideal and the real at the same time as well. So Matthew tells us in Matthew 19 that one day some Pharisees came to Jesus to test him. And they asked him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? Now, what you need to know is in their Jewish culture, they had created a version of no-fault divorce where if a man didn't want to be married to his wife anymore, well, all he had to do was look at her and say, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you. Yeah, 3 times. Just say it 3 times. That was it. No attorneys, no legal fees, no judge, no alimony payments, no splitting assets 50-50. She had to grab her few belongings. She had to leave immediately if he said that 3 times. Now, if women wanted to divorce their husbands, well, too bad in that culture. They were stuck. They did not have the legal right to divorce their husband. It was a terribly unfair system. So when Jesus is asked this question, here's how he responds. He looks back at him and he says, okay, guys, haven't you read that at the beginning? In other words, he's referring to the ideal, right? The way it was intended by God to work. In the beginning, the Creator made them male and female, Jesus said. And then God said, for this reason, a man's going to leave his father and mother and be united to his wife. The 2 are going to become one flesh. And then Jesus looks at him and he says, so they're no longer 2 but one flesh. Therefore, what God's joined together, let no one separate. This is fascinating to me. Jesus takes these guys all the way back to the beginning when the world was perfect, when the world was just the way God created it to be. And he says, okay, your whole discussion about which divorces are lawful, which ones aren't, it's kind of irrelevant. You have forgotten what God designed marriage to be to begin with. A marriage is when God makes 2 people one. And now you're trying to unone what God has made one, and that's impossible. So you're holding to the real, guys, but you have forgotten the ideal. You've lost sight of the goal, the standard. You've lost sight of what's actually best for people. I know things don't always work out between people. I mean, this is kind of Jesus' mindset. I understand people get divorced. I realize there needs to be a way to protect women from men having all the power. I realize we've got to have a mechanism or a tool for all of that. But I'm also not going to lose sight of the fact that in the beginning, divorce wasn't the plan. It was never the ideal. In the beginning, God designed marriage to make 2 people one. You can't unone what God has made one. That was Jesus' perspective. Now remember, they'd come to test him, right? But by this point, well, they've forgotten all about that. Now they've got questions based on what Jesus just said. They're like, what in the world, right? So they look at him and they say, okay, well, why then, Jesus? Why did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? In other words, why did Moses and our own law come up with this divorce thing if, Jesus, what you're saying is true? Are you telling us Moses is wrong? And Jesus looks back at him and he says, well, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. But it was not this way from the beginning. To which I think they probably thought, so Jesus, what are you going to do with all those divorced folks then? And Jesus goes, well, I'm not going to do anything to them. I'm going to do something for them. I'm going to give my life for them. I'm going to pay the penalty for all their sin that created that gap between the ideal and the real. Talk about creating tension. What do you do with that? Well, I'll tell you what you do. You don't let go of either the ideal or the real. You hold on to both. You carry both with you. You realize the standard is higher, but the grace is deeper. The expectations are higher, but the forgiveness is richer. So when it comes to the gaps between what's ideal and what's real in our own families, in our own lives, we've got a decision to make. Will we hold on to a standard that we all fall short of? Or are we going to try to redefine that standard just so we feel better about where we are? Or are we willing to aim our kids, if we have kids, towards an ideal that we haven't and we may never reach and we may never be able to model for them? Will we hold on to Jesus' ideal for our family and keep working towards it as our North Star, even though we're never possibly going to attain it? Or will we redefine what's ideal and change the rules just to fool ourselves into thinking, oh, there's no gap? Listen, if you're not a follower of Jesus, you get to make that choice for yourself. But for those of us who follow Jesus, we don't have permission from our King to change his standard that he set for us. But you can keep pursuing the ideal without guilt. Because listen, there is grace and forgiveness readily available from your Savior for all the gaps between what's ideal and real. And if you think about it, you actually want to be in a family that pursues the ideal because, well, the alternative's never good for you. Have you ever met a divorced man or woman who hoped their kids got divorced one day? No, of course not. Have you ever met parents who hope their daughter marries a guy who's planning to eventually trade up when she gets older? Well, no, that's ridiculous. You see, we all want better for the next generation. But you can't get to better if you let go of the ideal that will lead them there. That's a tension, but it's one that you don't want to lose. So during this series, we're going to point to a better, functional family goal, knowing that none of us are going to measure up to it. And we're going to talk about how we can move in that direction anyway. This week, would you just pay attention to where you're trying to let go of the ideal, where maybe you're lowering the standard, and then decide you're not going to fall for that trap? Because listen, you don't have to fall for that trap. While the standard is higher, our King's grace runs deeper. While his expectations are higher, his forgiveness runs richer. And it is that grace and forgiveness that gives us the strength to keep holding on to the ideal in our dysfunctional families.